All right, welcome back. We are still on the topic of political ecology, power, and environmental justice, and now we're really going to unpack that power component. So why theory matters for research, right? Now that we really have that core understanding of political ecology's foundations, let's examine, why power analysis is really essential for conservation research specifically. So I'm going to use conservation as a specific case study here, and I want to start with a claim that might surprise you. Okay. Conservation conflicts, human wildlife conflicts, they're not really often about conservation. They're almost always about power. Okay. What I mean is this, right? Conservation conflicts aren't just about competing resource use or conflicting values about nature or wildlife, eating crops or livestock, right? They're about essential power relations that determine whose values count, which uses of a landscape get priority, and how conflicts get resolved, right? Power shapes every conservation decision, yet most research treats it as just background noise, right? Rather than the central organizing principle of our evaluation. When a community loses access to forest resources, when certain voices dominate protected area management and meetings, or when indigenous knowledge systems are dismissed in favor of, scientific rigor, this is all power operating, right? But power is not just about who wins and loses, okay? It's about how, let's say, the game itself gets structured. What counts as a legitimate conservation problem? Whose knowledge is considered credible? Which solutions get funding and support, right? That's often the crux of many things at the end of the day. Let me give you several examples first to illustrate this, right? So let's say like cities across the US, urban green space, as we mentioned, is often distributed unequally, right? Wealthy neighborhoods have tree-lined streets and large parks. Low-income neighborhoods often have fewer trees, more concrete, higher temperatures, right? Look around. Denver, Los Angeles, major cities, gosh, even probably Boise, Idaho, and other areas, right? You can see this in full swing. And this is not, only featured in North America. We see this across the globe, and traditional conservation approaches, they're going to focus again, as we mentioned, or environmental solutions on technical solutions, right? Well, let's plant more trees. Let's get some more parks in here, right? But again, as we talked about just recently, right? Why is this green space distributed unequally in the first place, right? This is a political ecology line of inquiry. How have the zoning decisions, housing policies, and political representations shaped this urban environmental quality, right? And who has influence over these decisions? So you can see that we're moving from focusing only on those ecological outcomes, right? We are looking at building, a theoretical toolkit that transforms these observations into more systematic, deeper research, right? Where today I'm going to show you how to operationalize a few, foundational ideas and thinking processes through this that are going to give us some concrete ways to take kind of these abstract, complex ideas and put it in applied practice, right? Because it does sometimes sound like abstract theory. Trust me, I know. But it really is a research methodology that you can use, right? And you can put into practice. And by the end of this component of the lecture, you're going to know how to design studies that are going to reveal power dynamics, and you're going to practice this, right? So first, we're going to look at Michael Folcott's analysis of how power operates through knowledge production and institutional practices. We're also going to look at John Gaventa's three dimensions of power that help us understand how power operates visibly and invisibly. And then third, we're going to look at Shackleton et al.'s four types of power specifically developed for conservation contexts. Okay, so these frameworks absolutely build on political ecology's insights about scale, power, knowledge, and justice, which we just covered. And they're going to provide specific tools for this justice informed empirical investigation. Okay, so let's get started. So we'll start with Folcott. And this, analysis of power analytics really seeks to move beyond that domination dichotomy, right, that we mentioned in the previous lecture, about how we think about power, and these insights that Michael Folcott provided are particularly relevant for understanding conservation conflicts. But I want to start with what might be the most important insight, is that it's one challenge. It challenges common sense, right? Power isn't primarily about saying no. Okay, power is productive. It creates reality. What does this mean for conservation research, right? When conservation biologists classify ecosystems, tropical rainforests, temperate grasslands, marine habitat. They're not just describing nature neutrally, right? They are creating categories that enable certain interventions while making others unthinkable, unattainable, right? When communities get labeled as traditional or indigenous, this is not a neutral description, right? It's power operating through knowledge, creating categories that are shaping how those communities get treated in conservation policies, in forums and discussions, in the social systems we live and operate within, the intergovernmental panels, right? Think about the term sustainable development. This emerged in the 1980s. Folcott would have us trace its genealogy, right? Which institutions promoted it? What problems did it claim to solve? How it shaped what counted as legitimate development? This genealogical method reveals how seemingly natural concepts are actually historically contingent power arrangements, right? Our words have meaning. These are not terms or buzzwords that are here by coincidence, right? Sustainable development wasn't discovered, it was invented to resolve a particular political conflict in a particular historical moment, right? For research design, Foucauldian analysis means studying the production of truth claims rather than just accepting them as neutral knowledge, right? So let's go back to marine conservation. Instead of asking what is causing overfishing, we might ask how did certain fishing practices become classified as overfishing while others didn't, right? We might examine scientific papers, policy documents, and media coverage to trace how knowledge gets produced and circulated, right? That sounds fascinating. In urban environmental justice research, instead of asking what is causing these environmental health problems, we might ask how did these certain neighborhoods become defined as environmental health hazards, right? While others are classified as healthy communities. So you can see how we're kind of flipping the script. We are changing the narrative, right? Methodologically, this translates to discourse analysis, document genealogies, and attention to how expertise is constructed and valued. Okay. In this approach, you're not just collecting data on what happened, right? You are studying how what happened becomes thinkable, becomes in part of our vocabulary, becomes part of our ideation in the first place, right? Let me give you a practice exercise, right, to kind of wrap your head around this, right? So let's think about the term like wilderness, right? Okay. Now, how would we trace the word wilderness as genealogy, right? When did this concept emerge? What institutions promoted it? What problems did it claim to solve? How has its meaning changed over time? What interventions does this concept make possible? And what alternatives does it foreclose, right? This genealogical analysis often is going to reveal these hidden power relationships embedded in seemingly neutral concepts, right? Ben Hale within the Department of Environmental Studies at CU Boulder has examined this extensively and has written books on it. It's fascinating, right? Many people are thinking about these things, and I would highly encourage you to pursue these lines of thinking. But these, Falcott insights don't reject scientific knowledge. Don't get me wrong here, but they do help us understand how all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, emerges from particular social contexts and serves particular interests, right? This understanding is essential for designing more equitable and effective conservation approaches and justice-focused research. Okay. So let's move on to Gaventa, right? Gaventa's three dimensions, focus around mapping power operations, right? So these three dimensions of power that Gaventa highlight, they provide a systematic way to really study power's multiple operations, right? And this framework is particularly useful when we are helping or when we are looking to study only, or study why only visible power relations misses how power most effectively operates, right? So most research stops at this first dimension, right? Asking who wins the policy battles, right? We exist in a world of incredibly increasing polarization and tribal politics, right? But Gaventa is asking us to go further, right? And this framework shows us that more subtle forms of power often matter and matter more in some cases, right? So the first dimension is visible power, right? Direct decision making authority. Who's making the decision? Who wins when there are conflicts? This is, the most obvious form of power, and also, make this connection back to procedural justice as well. It's what most political analysis focuses on. In protected area management, right, the first dimension might look at, who's deciding where this protected area is getting established, which organizations have the official authority over this management decision, and when there are conflicts over resource access, whose preferences are prevailing, right? The second dimension is hidden power, right? Ooh. Agenda setting authority, right? This operates through controlling what gets discussed and what remains off the table in the first place, right? So here's what's subtle about this, right? The most effective use of second dimension power often look like there's no power being exercised at all. Issues simply don't come up for discussion, right? In community conservation meetings, you know, pay attention to what doesn't get discussed. If compensation for crop damage is always on the agenda, but land tenure never comes up, that's second dimension power at work right there, right? Someone has the power to keep certain issues invisible. The third dimension is invisible power, hidden to invisible, ideological authority. This operates through shaping consciousness itself, making certain arrangements seem natural and inevitable. We see this in our life every day. This is one of the most sophisticated forms of power because it operates by making people think that existing arrangements are the only possible arrangements, that they are like a natural order. Capitalism is a great example of this, right? That's a made up concept, a social concept, right? That we believe is just the only possible arrangement for economy, right? Here's a conservation example, right? When farmers in wildlife corridors say, "Hey, elephants have always been here, we just have to adapt." I've heard this many times. I've seen this many times, right? They might be expressing this entrenched third dimensions of power that has neutralized their disadvantage, right? It's made it a part of accepted reality, right? The power is so effective that people they're not even recognizing that they're being disadvantaged. This is not good. This is pervasive. It is hard to root out. You could also think about environmental racism in North American cities, right? When people say, right, that's just how the city was developed, or people choose to live in those neighborhoods. We talked about this, environmental racism, chicken or the egg, right? They might be expressing this third dimension of power that makes environmental inequality just seem neutral rather than it's a full political production. So research design requires different methods for each dimension, right? If we're going to try to unpack these things. And this is where it gets really practical for your own research, okay? So for the first dimension of power, you can observe meetings, track voting patterns, map who gets their way, right? Direct observation and document analysis work well because, again, this is visible, right? For second dimension power, you can compare what's discussed in different venues, interview participants about topics they'd like to raise, and analyze which issues never appear on formal agendas, but you're hearing them discussed by participants or within the community. Okay. You do need comparative analysis and indirect questioning for this. Okay. For the third dimension of power, this is examining narratives, studying how people explain their situations, looking for those internalized constraints. Think about qualitative analysis we just discussed, right? You need interpretive myths, right? And here's the crucial point for environmental and conservation research. If you only study that first dimension, you're going to miss completely how the power operates most effectively through those second and third dimensions, right? So again, this framework, these ideas directly connect to power mapping. And when you're mapping power relationships, don't just identify who has the formal authority, right? Ask what issues aren't being discussed, right? How do different actors explain why certain problems exist? What seems natural or inevitable, right? Apply these in practice, right? How is this actually being politically produced? And that draws well into Shackleton's thinking and their sort of typology of conservation power. So this framework was specifically developed for conservation contexts, right? And while Gavinta's dimensions describe how power operates, Shackleton, seeks to describe where power is located, right? Create typologies. This gives us a complementary analytical tool that's particularly relevant, as I mentioned, in conservation, environmental protection research, environmental programs and policies, right? This typology is going to identify four types of power that operate simultaneously in conservation contexts, right? You have actor power, institutional power, structural power, and discursive power, okay? Did you like that? Oh. Actor power is individual and organizational capacity to influence outcomes, right? Or I'm sorry, actor power is individual and organizational capacity to influence outcomes. That's what I just said. I haven't had enough coffee today. This includes, let's say, like World Wildlife Fund's financial resources and global network, a park director's decision-making authority, or a community leader's ability to mobilize collective action. Okay? Let's think about like an oil pipeline conflict. Actor power is going to include energy companies, their financial resources and political connections, environmental organizations' mobilization capacity and legal expertise, and let's say indigenous communities' cultural authority and land rights claims, right? These are the actors within this situation. Institutional power is what is going to operate through the rules and norms, right? There are institutions as actors, but this is the formal and informal rules and norms, right? Formal rules include laws, regulations, and policies. Informal rules include traditional authority structures, cultural norms, and resource access. These are unwritten protocols about participation in decision making. Okay. We're going back to the high seas, right? Institutional power in marine conservation and protected areas includes federal laws governing ocean access, state regulation about fishing licenses, local enforcement practices, and informal norms about, which fishing communities get consulted in management decisions. Structural injustice, structural power is the deep architecture of political economy, right? The market systems, the state structures, the global trade arrangements. This is power that operates through economic and political systems rather than individual or organizational choice, be acting on its accord. In climate adaptation, for example, structural power includes market systems that determine flood insurance availability, federal policies that shape disaster recovery funding, and global economic arrangements that concentrate climate vulnerability in particular regions and communities. Okay. Now, discursive power operates through narratives, knowledge systems, and problem framing, right? I kind of set you up for this as we were talking through different frameworks. When conservation problems are framed as technical rather than political, that's discursive power at play. When local ecological knowledge gets dismissed again as anecdotal or informal, while scientific knowledge is treated as objective and powerful, well, that's discursive power right there, right? So let me show you how all four types can operate together. This, may be a context that I've touched on a lot, but like, let's say actor power includes environmental justice organizations, community organizing capacity, city planning departments, regulatory authority, and real estate developers' financial resources. Institutional power includes the zoning laws that determine land use, environmental regulations that govern pollution permits, and informal practices about community consultation and development projects. Okay. Structural power is going to include those housing markets that concentrate currently and historically poverty in environmentally hazardous areas. And this could also include tax systems that provide incentives for certain types of development and economic arrangements that make some neighborhoods profitable for investment while others aren't. Here's where discursive power threads the needle, right? This is narratives about urban development versus environmental protection, scientific knowledge about health effects and cultural beliefs about which neighborhoods deserve environmental quality, right? Each power type requires a specific research method, and this is crucial for your understanding, right? Actor power really requires interviews and resource analysis, right? Getting to that individual level. Institutional power can be done through document analysis and ethnographic observation of rule following. Okay, we're going to talk about ethnography in the next lecture. Structural power needs political economy. We didn't talk about political economy yet, but you could think about it similarly to political ecology, but we're thinking about economic practices, right? But it requires political economy analysis and historical investigation. Discursive power needs narrative analysis and attention to those knowledge production systems, okay? So in power mapping, your task is to identify examples of each power type in the case that you're seeking to evaluate, right? Do not try to go after all four comprehensively, right? That is a PhD dissertation. That's a very serious research program. But demonstrate that you can recognize each type and design and the appropriate methods that you would use to study them, right? This analysis should show how different types of power interact, right? How does discursive power legitimize certain actors' power arrangements, right? How do institutional rules reflect structural power relations? These interactions can often reveal the most important leverage points for change, okay? And that's what we're trying to get to in many cases. So, putting this all together, operationalizing theory through research design framework, let's translate this to concrete research protocols, right? So first, you're going to map the actors, right, and identify the power relationships. I've messed up this slide and there's some type here. I hope that's not confusing. I think it's old leftover text. Method, without theory is description. Is that over here? Method without theory is description. Oh gosh, I'm so far behind. So let's go back a little bit more. So theory without method is speculation. Okay, this is where we are. Sorry. Operationalizing this, really means translating these theoretical insights into systematic research approaches that can generate reliable evidence about these power relations, right? Remember we talked how important evidence is in the last, video, right? So start with power mapping, right? Identify all the actors that you can, come up with and identify in the conservation case from local communities, international NGOs. Map those formal relationships, right? Who reports to who? What are the official authority structures? Map informal relationships, right? Who is influencing whom? Where do important conversations happen outside formal channels? Where do important conversations happen that might be hidden, right? Who's having a beer with who, right? This mapping becomes your sampling frame for interviews and your guide for observation sites, right? It's creating that protocol for how you're going to start to collect data. If your power map shows that certain actors are central to decision making, they then become priority interview targets. Okay. If certain venues are crucial for informal influence, they may become important observation sites. Okay. Step two is aligning this with a theoretical lens, right? So selecting that theoretical lens based on your research question. And again, there's different frameworks that are going to illuminate different aspects of power relations. Okay. You might want to create your own framework or draw on existing, right? So if you're studying, like, let's say, why certain conservation policies fail despite apparent technical soundness, this is what I look at. Gavinto's dimensions help you examine agenda setting and consciousness shaping. Okay. If you're analyzing how conservation conflicts get resolved, Shackleton's typology helps you identify different sources of influence and leverage. So now you've got your, the blueprint of your house, right? Now you're going to design methods and triangulation deliberately, right? Each power type requires different data sources, and systematic triangulation provides more reliable analysis. Remember what we talked about in qualitative analysis? So, actor power really needs interviews with key decision makers, as we talked about, and resource analysis of organizational capacity. Institutional power really thrives around document analysis of formal rules and ethnographic observation of how rules operate in practice, right? Structural power focuses on and does well with historical analysis about how current arrangements emerged and political economy investigation on economic constraints, right? Discursive power thrives within narrative analysis of how problems get framed and attention to whose knowledge gets treated as authoritative, right? So you can develop these scientific protocols for each method. Your interview guides should include questions targeting different power types. Your observation protocols should attend to power performances and spatial arrangements and rule enforcement, right? Your document analysis should trace power claims and knowledge construction, right? Plan analysis that links empirical findings back to theory. Easier said than done. But don't just describe again what you found. Explain how it illuminates theoretical predictions about power operations, right? Show how your case contributes to broader understanding of power and conservation contexts. Okay, just going through my notes. I'm going to skip this part. So, ethics and reflexivity, as you can imagine, are incredibly vital within this space, right? So, oh no, like I was big and now I'm small. So, before we conclude again, we need to address the ethical complexities of power research. Okay, studying power is never, maybe not never, it is not often ethically neutral because research itself involves power relationships that can reproduce or challenge existing inequalities. Woof. If you're going to do this kind of research, maybe like write this down on a note in the journal, read it over and over again, right? Power analysis really demands ethical reflexivity because research relationships are themselves power relationships. When you interview community members about their conflicts with conservation authorities, guess what? You're asking them to trust you with potentially dangerous information. When you interview government officials, guess what? You're accessing elite knowledge that might not be shared with communities. Informed consent becomes complex when studying power because potential risks vary dramatically across power hierarchies, okay? Community members might face economic retaliation or social ostracism for sharing certain information. Government officials might face professional embarrassment or policy criticism. Elite participants might have resources to protect themselves, while community participants might be more vulnerable, right? Consider developing differentiated consent processes that are going to address specific vulnerabilities and benefits for different participant categories and pay close attention to these, right? Standard consent forms might and often can't adequately capture these different risk profiles, right? This becomes very complex when you're doing institutional review, but it's crucial, right? Confidentiality serves different functions across power hierarchies, right? Protecting community members from retaliation might require strict anonymity, no names, no identifiers, right? But complete anonymity can also reduce accountability for power abuse. So navigate these tensions through transparent discussions with participants about attribution preferences, potential consequences, pilot study, talk to people, get to know them, conduct analysis on the political and social culture and temperature of where you seek to work, right? Some participants might want their perspectives attributed to build credibility, while others require anonymity for protection. I've experienced this in interviews where folks didn't feel comfortable talking about that. So they hinted at it, right? Or others were straight up forthcoming and said, yeah, tell them I said that, right? This is where reciprocity comes in, right? We've talked about this. It means different things to different actors, right? Communities might want research results that are going to help them with their advocacy campaigns. Government agencies might want analyses that improve their programs. NGOs might want evidence for their fundraising efforts, right? You're not going to be able to satisfy everyone, but you can be transparent about these commitments and limitations, right? Do not make promises you cannot fulfill. Consider how your research can serve participant interest beyond just academic publication. Full stop. Okay? But be honest, right? And be realistic and be careful. Tread lightly, right? Do no harm. Representation, recognition is incredibly fraught in power studies, right? Whose voices are getting amplified through our research? How can we avoid reproducing these power inequalities through our analysis, right? Academic platforms themselves, policy briefings, media coverage, they tend to favor certain types of voices over others. Excuse me. Consider how your research might reproduce existing inequalities. Are we just amplifying the already privileged voices and marginalizing further others, right? Again, this doesn't mean we should avoid elite interviews, right? That's where the power might be sitting. But it does mean being intentional about representation balance and considering how we're amplifying marginalized voices effectively. Reflexivity, right? You also need ongoing reflexivity about your own power position as a researcher. Analytical memo is your friend, research journal is your friend. Reflection. We ask you to do so many reflections, through your educational journey. Like, that's not just busy work, it's a key component. Self awareness is so critical to being a functioning human in society, let alone a scientist or a policymaker, etc. Anyway, your education, your nationality, institutional affiliation, funding sources, positionality, this is going to shape existing power arrangements that you're going to bring to the table, right? Are you seen as aligned with a government or NGO or community interests when you're conducting an interview? Like, how is your presence changing interaction dynamics, right? When I conduct for my dissertation in Thailand, my research assistant does all the interviews, right? If I go as a white male outsider, there's a chance that's going to bias the comfortability and the way people are going to respond to the interview, right? I made the interview guide. I trained my research assistant on it, but it's much better for him to go and conduct those interviews. We're going to get better data, right? We learned that through pilot study, right? Think about this. Think about these things. Be explicit about your positioning while recognizing that neutrality isn't achievable or necessarily desirable. So, right, these ethical complexities, they don't have simple solutions, but they do require ongoing attention and transparent discussion with participants throughout your research process, right? It's iterative. Research at this level is the best when it involves participants as active researchers as well, not just subjects, right? Ethical power research contributes to social justice rather than just academic knowledge. Wow, that's like a that really rhymes there, right? Social justice rather than just academic knowledge. I like that. Okay. So looking ahead, right, from theory to practice, we've covered a lot of theoretical ground today, right? I have given you a lot of case studies. I'm not going to go like too deep into this because I gave you a ton of examples when we were talking about these, but this would be like a case study for wildlife corridors, right? How does power shape wildlife corridor management? These are some questions that you could ask through Gavinta's dimensions. These are some areas you could focus on through Shackleton's types, right? And then, this shows, really how power analysis is going to reveal these leverage points for interventions, okay? So again, with the assignment related to power analysis, right? You're going to choose a conservation conflict with identifiable power dynamics. You're going to select 2 to 3 theoretical concepts from today or elsewhere, right? You're really going to impress me if you bring something new. You're going to design some methods targeting different power types and dimensions. We went into this in depth, right? You're going to develop interview protocols and observation guides at a high level that you could use, right? And then you're going to create an analysis plan linking data to theoretical predictions, right? Make this build on your final project. This is not busy work. This is practical, applied work, right? I want you to demonstrate that power analysis isn't just a critique. It's systematic investigation that reveals opportunities for more effective and equitable conservation outcomes, right? Do I expect this to be like ready to be deployed, fully academically sound? No, we're practicing, right? But this is what I really want you to demonstrate. I really want to see that you're actually listening to these videos, you're actually understanding these concepts, that you're applying them to the assignment, right? I will be able to tell. Okay, I will be able to tell. So we've gone over a lot of different frameworks. I've given you some background on the assignment. We have one more lecture in the series to discuss. Um, one more, right? Yeah, on interviews. No, 2 more. We have one on ethnography and interviews, right? So please tune into those as well. I will do my best to keep those shorter. Okay. So next will be power mapping and ethnography methods. So we'll go a little bit deeper into power mapping that'll help with your assignment. I will see you there.